Sure. Here's the first segment written in first-person perspective, with a unique and engaging narrative. When we first pulled up to our new house, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. It was a beautiful two-story home with a large porch, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. The kind of place that felt like it had history, where kids rode their bikes on the sidewalk and families waved at each other while watering their lawns. It was everything we had ever wanted. But as we stepped out of the car, I could feel the weight of 100 invisible eyes watching us. The first actual neighbor I met wasn't in person, but through the slight parting of white curtains across the street. A pale face peered out, barely visible, and then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I brushed it off, telling myself they were just curious. After all, we were the first black family to move into this community, at least as far as I could tell. My wife, Lisa, was already busy helping our kids, Jordan and Ava, get out of the car, their voices full of excitement. "Look at that tree, Dad. Can I climb it?" Jordan asked, pointing to a sturdy oak in the front yard. I smiled and ruffled his curls. "Maybe later, buddy. Let's get inside first." As we started unpacking, the first neighbor to actually introduce themselves was a woman named Karen. Yes, Karen, no joke. She was in her late 50s, blonde bob, perfectly pressed slacks, and a stiff smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She walked up to us like a store manager approaching a customer they suspected of shoplifting. "Hello," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you. I'm Marcus. This is my wife Lisa, and these are our kids." I extended my hand, but she hesitated a second too long before shaking it. "So, where are you coming from?" she asked, her eyes scanning us in a way that made my skin crawl. Lisa answered cheerfully, "We just moved from the city. We were looking for a quieter place to raise the kids." Karen's smile tightened. "The city, huh? Must be different here for you." I caught the meaning behind her words. Lisa did too. We exchanged a glance, but neither of us reacted. Instead, we kept smiling, giving her nothing to latch onto. She made some excuse about having to check on dinner and left, but not before making sure we knew that the neighborhood had certain expectations about noise levels, lawn care, and respecting community traditions. By the time the sun set, we had already noticed the stairs. People walking their dogs slowed down just a little too much in front of our house. A couple of men standing on their driveways gave each other looks before heading inside. And I was almost certain I heard the words, "Who let them in?" muttered somewhere down the street. Lisa sighed as she set down a box in the living room. "You feel that?" I nodded. "Yeah," she shook her head. "Same old story." I forced a smile, but deep down, something in my gut twisted. We had worked so hard to get here. This house, this life, it was supposed to be a fresh start. But already I could feel the storm brewing before the first drop of rain had even fallen. The first few days in the neighborhood were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Lisa and I went about our days trying to settle in, unpacking boxes, and making our new house feel like home. But there was always this feeling, this unshakable sense that we were being watched. It started with the little things, the way Karen would always just happen to be outside whenever we were, watering her plants, checking her mailbox, wiping down her already spotless front porch. Always close enough to keep an eye on us, but never quite interacting. Then, the complaints started. It was a Saturday morning when I first saw her marching up our driveway, a frown pressed onto her face like it had been carved there permanently. "Marcus," she said, not even bothering with a hello. "I just wanted to mention that we have a rule in this neighborhood about keeping our yards neat. Some of us take a lot of pride in our landscaping. I looked around, confused. Our lawn was fine. The grass was freshly cut, the hedges trimmed. "Is there a problem?" I asked. She forced a smile. "Oh, no problem, per se. Just some of the neighbors were talking. We like things to be a certain way around here." Lisa, who had just stepped out onto the porch, crossed her arms. "Are you saying our lawn is a problem?" Karen let out a small laugh, like she was trying to make it sound friendly. "Oh no, dear, not at all. Just a friendly reminder. We all do our part to keep the neighborhood looking presentable." She walked away before we could say anything else. That was just the beginning. A few days later, I found a note taped to our mailbox. "Keep your noise down at night. Some of us have to work in the morning." Lisa and I exchanged confused looks. The only noise coming from our house at night was the sound of our kids laughing before bedtime, and maybe the TV at a reasonable volume. Nothing louder than any other house on the block. Then the police showed up. It was a Wednesday evening. I had just gotten home from work when there was a knock at the door. 2 officers stood on our porch, their hands resting casually on their belts. "Good evening, sir," one of them said. "We've had a noise complaint from one of your neighbors." I blinked. "Noise complaint?" "We haven't been making any noise." "Just routine, sir." The caller mentioned loud music, possible disturbances. I exhaled sharply, already knowing who had called. "We have 2 kids. We're not throwing parties or blasting music." The officer nodded like he had expected that response. "Just making sure. Have a good night." As they walked away, I noticed Karen standing on her porch, watching, pretending to sweep non-existent dust off her steps. That night, Lisa was furious. "This is harassment," she said, pacing in the living room. "She's trying to make us uncomfortable." I sighed. "Yeah, but what do we do? Confront her?" "That's exactly what she wants, to prove we don't belong here." Lisa rubbed her temples. "I hate this. We worked so hard for this house, and now we have to tiptoe around because of some bitter old lady?" The next morning, things escalated. I walked outside to get the newspaper and saw something spray-painted on the sidewalk in front of our house. "Go back where you came from." A chill ran through me. I clenched my jaw, forcing down the anger bubbling in my chest. I didn't want the kids to see this. I didn't want Lisa to wake up to it. I grabbed a hose and started washing it away. The words fading, but the feeling of them still burning under my skin. The message was clear. Karen, and whoever else in this neighborhood agreed with her, wasn't just annoyed that we were here. She wanted us gone. A week passed, and the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lisa and I did our best to ignore it, to keep our heads high and live our lives as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. Karen wasn't alone in her mission to make us feel unwelcome. The stares had turned into whispers, the whispers into murmurs loud enough for us to hear. The mail started arriving late. Our trash bins mysteriously got knocked over during the night. Little things small enough to brush off individually, but together they painted a clear picture. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. I had just gotten home from work when I saw a black car parked outside our house. The moment I stepped out of my car, the door to that vehicle opened, and an older man, well-dressed in a sharp gray suit, stepped out. He had the kind of presence that demanded attention. Tall, poised, with sharp eyes that looked like they had seen a lifetime of experiences. I didn't recognize him, but something about him felt familiar. Before I could say anything, Karen came storming across the street, her usual smugness replaced with something I had never seen before. Panic. "Excuse me, sir," she said quickly, her voice breathless. "Can I help you with something?" The man turned slowly, his gaze settling on her. He didn't speak right away, letting the weight of his silence press down on the moment. Then, in a deep, measured voice, he said, "No, you cannot." Karen's face paled. "Oh, well, I noticed you were here, and I'm here to see my grandson," he interrupted. For a second, I didn't understand. Then his eyes turned to me, and realization crashed over me like a wave. This was my grandfather. The thing was, I had never met him before. My father had never spoken much about his side of the family. I knew bits and pieces, whispers of an estranged grandfather, a man of power and influence, someone who had chosen a different path than the rest of us, but I had never expected to meet him, let alone like this. "Grandfather?" I asked, still in shock. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Yes, Marcus. It's been a long time." I didn't know what to say. My mind was still processing. But Karen, oh, she was staring now. Her eyes darted between me and him, confusion and something else, something like dread forming on her face. "You're his grandfather?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct," he said, clasping his hands in front of him. "And you are?" Karen blinked rapidly. I'm Karen. I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her tone had changed completely. Gone was the sharpness, the passive-aggressive superiority. Now, she sounded nervous. I watched as she fumbled for words, her confidence crumbling right in front of me. And then, it hit me. She knew who he was. My grandfather turned back to me. "May I come inside?" I nodded quickly, still unsure of what was happening but eager to get away from Karen's wide-eyed stare. As we stepped inside, I stole one last glance at her. She was frozen in place, her hands gripping the edges of her cardigan, looking like she had just seen a ghost. And in that moment I realized something about my grandfather terrified her. I closed the door behind us, my mind still racing. Lisa walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She froze when she saw the man standing in our living room. "Marcus, who is this?" she asked cautiously. I swallowed, still struggling to fully process it myself. "Lisa, this is my grandfather." Her eyes widened. "Your grandfather?" He nodded, stepping forward with a kind but authoritative presence. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Lisa. I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I felt it was time." Time for what? That was the question burning in my mind. We sat down in the living room, and for the first time, I noticed something about my grandfather. He carried himself like a man who was used to being in control, used to commanding attention. His suit was sharp, his watch expensive, and his voice carried a weight of importance. "Marcus," he started, folding his hands together. "I regret that we've been strangers for so long. Your father chose to separate from this side of the family, and I respected his wishes. But when I learned you had moved into this neighborhood, I had to come." Lisa and I exchanged a glance. "Why?" I asked hesitantly. He sighed, looking almost amused. "Because, my boy, I know this place, and more importantly, I know her, your neighbor Karen." The air in the room shifted. Lisa leaned forward. "You know Karen?" A dark chuckle escaped his lips. "Oh, yes, we go back quite some time." I clenched my jaw. "She's been harassing us, grandfather, ever since we moved in." His expression hardened. "I assumed as much." He leaned back, exhaling. "Karen's family has a history in this town just as I do. But the difference is, my history built this place. Hers, it clung to the past." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Grandfather's gaze darkened. "Marcus, I was one of the first black businessmen in this city to break through the barriers that people like Karen's family tried to uphold. I built businesses, properties, power, and Karen's father, he hated me for it. Her family was one of the loudest voices against my success. They believed people like us should know our place. A chill ran down my spine. Lisa shook her head. So, she's been treating us like this because of you? Because of what I represent? Grandfather corrected. She recognized my last name, I'm sure of it. And the moment she saw you moving in, she knew. He smiled slightly. Karen may think she owns this street with her petty complaints, but she seems to have forgotten one thing. I raised an eyebrow. And what's that? His eyes twinkled with something sharp. I still own this neighborhood. The room fell into silence. Lisa was the first to speak. Wait, what? Grandfather chuckled. I never sold my stake in this community. The land Karen's house is built on, the entire block. It was all part of my investment portfolio years ago. Even after I stepped back from active management, my name remained on several deeds. He leaned forward, looking me dead in the eye. Marcus, you're not just a resident here. You're part of the legacy that built this place. And Karen, she's been living on land that she never truly owned. I sat back, stunned. So, what happens now? Grandfather smiled. Now? We remind Karen exactly who she's been messing with. The next morning, Karen was back outside, acting as if nothing had happened. But when she saw my grandfather standing on our porch, speaking on his phone, something in her demeanor cracked. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up in front of her house. A well-dressed man stepped out, holding a briefcase. He knocked on her door, and we watched as she opened it, her face going pale the moment she saw him. Lisa and I stood on our porch, watching as the conversation unfolded. Karen was shaking her head, waving her hands, but the man remained composed. Finally, he handed her an envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Grandfather turned to me. That's her eviction notice. I almost choked. You evicted her? He smiled. She never owned this house, Marcus. She's been renting from a company she never bothered to research. A company owned by me. Karen's eyes darted toward us, horror written all over her face. She knew it was over. 2 months later, Karen was gone. The house was put back on the market, and in a twist of poetic justice, it was purchased by a black family. A young couple, excited to start fresh in what they thought was a welcoming neighborhood. And this time, it would be. Grandfather's visit changed everything. Not just because of Karen, but because of what it revealed. I had spent so much time feeling like an outsider here, like we had to prove ourselves. But the truth was, we belonged. Not just because we bought a house, but because we had earned our place, generations ago. And no amount of whispers, complaints, or prejudice could ever change that.